Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Anthony Larson, and we're meeting here thanks to the work of Stephen Retz, who's been putting this series together. So I appreciate your interest and your attendance. Even though our numbers are few, we can probably manage to cover a few topics that will be of interest. This time, in fact, for this lecture and the next two lectures after this one, I'm going to be talking about my books, Moon Shall Turn to Blood, The Earth Shall Reel to and Fro, and There Shall Be a New Heaven and New Earth. So I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions. So if you have questions, we'll try to address them. But this topic for this one shall be The Moon Shall Turn to Blood. Now, if you've read the books, you know that the concept is an entirely different interpretation of history and prophecy than the one you've probably been used to seeing. And I think this was necessary because we've kind of drifted away. If you've read some of my later work, it's obvious that the Christian community as a whole has drifted away from the original interpretations and put a whole new spin on it, such that religion today has virtually nothing to do or no understanding of the metaphors that were used by the prophets. Once you understand the metaphors, then prophecy is easy to understand. But without the knowledge of those metaphors and where they came from, it's kind of difficult. A good example would be in the Exodus, which is what the subject of the book is about. And for those of you who haven't seen the book, this is the cover. The idea that hail fell during the Exodus is so common and so widespread. Typically, most people believe it was hail, such like what we would get in a summer thunderstorm. Little pellets of ice, snowy kinds of things. Sometimes they're not so small. Sometimes they're quite large. But the curious thing is that when you look at the original Hebrew word for this sort of thing, they use the word barad. Let me write that down for you. And this is something, if you've read the book, you've seen that. Oops. I would barad with a D. Forgive my dyslexia. It was barad, and barad meant not hail, but hot stones. That's how it would typically be translated. And you say, well, how did it become hot stone, or how did it become hail when the word said hot stones? Well, there's an interesting story about that. The King James translators were all scholars and scientists, and they were responsible for translating the original Greek or Hebrew or any text that they could authenticate to create our King James Version of the Bible. And it was common knowledge in those days that stones did not fall out of the sky. The only stones that their science admitted was hailstones. So they believed that using the word hailstones was a correct translation of the word barad. But as it turns out, that's more about their scientific understanding and their cultural training. The peasants that worked the fields knew that things like meteorites had fallen out of the sky and hit the ground. but the intelligentsia, the cultured class, believed that was just stupid people making stupid assessments. There was no such thing as hot stones falling out of the sky. So that's just one example of how translators can do damage to the text and destroy the original meaning. When they think they're doing the right thing, they're doing absolutely the wrong thing. So, maybe that little factoid will help you see how important, in my opinion, and of course, I wrote the book, so I would feel this way about it, but in my opinion, this kind of a treatise has long been needed to correct the misconceptions in Christianity, not just in Mormonism, but Christianity in general. In my naivete, I thought Latter-day Saints would be anxious to see what all of this meant and how it related to Joseph Smith's teachings. Imagine my surprise when I subsequently learned that Mormons were just as happy with their misguided concepts of prophecy as mainstream Christianity was. And of course, there's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll probably get to that subject in a future lecture. But for now, we're going to talk just about this book. Let me, if you'll indulge me, let me just read the first paragraph of the preface here and talk a bit about that. As you, the reader, embark on the wondrous quest through the past and the future depicted in this book, be prepared to lay aside some of the secular notions you have taken for granted nearly all your life. I thought merely stating that would be sufficient. It was not. In fact, I've subsequently learned that most people that open the book read the first few paragraphs and set it aside, saying, this is bizarre. I've never read anything like this before. And again, in another lecture, we'll talk about why that might be true. At the same time, be prepared to have the reality of biblical events and the words of the prophets confirmed for you far beyond anything you might have imagined possible. When you finish reading this book, your concept of the prophets, the past and the future, will be changed forever. Well, I discovered, obviously, that people don't like to have their views changed. They have lived with them for a long time, and they're very comfortable with their views. And the more complicated the explanation, the less likely people are to pay attention to it. The problem, therefore, is we're dealing with a complicated interpretation, a very new interpretation with a lot of information that has to be digested, has to be internalized. And that takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of thinking. And that's a requirement that most people are unwilling to fulfill. Instead, they, when presented with this kind of an idea, they get the feeling that there must be something wrong with it. A, because it's not been presented to them before, and B, because it seems way too complicated and will take way too much effort to master. So they immediately project their concerns onto the messenger. And I am the messenger, so I'm told that I'm out of the way. I'm often called to repentance and told that I have misunderstood and that I need to re-examine my bizarre beliefs and fall in line, so to speak. So I thought I would share that. And then I wrote here about why is there another book on prophecy. And let me explain more thoroughly than I did in the original text. This book is about the origin of prophetic metaphors. A metaphor is, to put it simply, life is like a river flowing slowly through the valley, changing the scenery. That sort of imagery is the kind of thing that the prophets used all the time. The Savior used it. He used this in his parables. And we make the mistake of thinking that it's just pretty language, that it's something that Isaiah is often cited as being very poetic, very literary because of those kinds of metaphors. The truth of the matter is that all prophecy is a metaphor. Not that it isn't talking about very real things, because it is. But that's why this book was important, because up to this point, I'm going to point a few fingers here. Up to this point, we only had people like Cleon Skousen. How do you S-K-O-U-S. Thank you. My wife knows because she lived up the street from him. He was a gospel doctrine instructor in her ward in her growing up years. We had Cleon Skousen. We had Elder Bruce R. McConkie. And later on we had Crowther. In his book, Prophecy, Key to the Future. And so I addressed this in my book. What do we need another book on prophecy? My goodness. Elder McConkie was a member of the Quorum of the 12, and therefore we have some real heavyweights, scholarly heavyweights, that have already written about all of this. So what could I possibly bring to the table that we can't already have? Well, all of these good men created what is called a catalog of prophetic utterances and tried to make sense of the sequence of events. And in most cases, they took prophetic metaphors literally. And hence the name of the book, And the Moon Shall Turn to Blood. Just like the water in the Nile River during the Exodus, the moon did not literally turn to blood. That is a metaphor. It's a descriptive term to emphasize what a dramatic thing it was. It didn't turn to blood, it began glowing. You see, in a planetary encounter, just to kind of as an aside, in a planetary encounter, tremendous electromagnetic forces are unleashed as two planets begin to come together, moving in parallel but not perfectly parallel orbits. They're drawn together electromagnetically. At the same time, at a distance, the electromotive force, the push-pull, as I call it, at a distance, that force pulls them together. But as the distance decreases between these two bodies, a new force comes up, the electromotive force, the same thing that keeps that train in Japan off the ground, off the rail bed, is the suspension on an electromagnetic bed. Holds the whole train up so it can go 200 plus miles per hour. A similar effect is happening here. So as these planets become close together, the same kind of force that drew them together now keeps them from colliding. We have an anti-collision system built into our planet. And this is what they're talking about when they say the moon shall turn to blood. There's a braking force that happens. And just like in your automobile, when you press the brakes, there's friction, and the friction causes what? Heat. Heat is the most common denominator in energy transfer. In this case, the moon, of course, is a innocent bystander as Earth and this intruder approach one another. And the moon is heated up in a very similar way to the way you heat up food in a microwave oven. But because the Earth, the moon does not have an air conditioning system like the Earth does, water and an atmosphere to absorb some of that heat, to wick it away from the planet, the moon has no alternative but to glow like a cinder in a fire in space. You think of space as being cold and like a deep freeze. It's not. I mean, it is. There is an absence of heat, but it is not what they call, physicists call a heat sink. So it cannot wick the heat away from the moon, and the moon begins to glow. So that's the kind of metaphor that this book and everything else that I've written since is about. Understanding how to interpret the metaphors that the prophets use. When the water turns to blood in the Nile River during the Exodus, the prophet's not saying it literally turns to blood. He's saying it just got red. That's a good description. We name a certain river the Colorado, which in Spanish means colored. But it specifically refers to red, not any other color. And so we use terms like that all the time without understanding their origins. So the Colorado River is a colored river, is what we're really saying. The same thing with the prophetic metaphor. So all of these scholars I've listed here attempted in one way or another to catalog prophecy, to say, well, this event seems to happen first, followed by this event, and naturally this event followed that one, and so on and so forth. And they try to build a scenario for prophecy. None of them addressed the metaphor because they took the metaphor literally. When the prophet says that the water in the Nile River turned red, the most common interpretation was that an event called transmogrification came about. Oops. That's a long word. Let's not even worry about it. Transmogrification, that is, literally the water turned into blood. Now, this is the same thing that Catholics do with the sacrament. They call it, of course, the Eucharist. They say that when it's placed on the tongue, it becomes real flesh and real blood. As in Christ's statement, this is my flesh and this is my blood. Eat, drink. That kind of literal interpretation of prophecy does a great deal of harm to our understanding. We take it to be a literal event. So when the moon turns to blood, we think, oh yeah, the moon gets bloody. No, it doesn't. So understanding the real nature of cataclysmic events during the Exodus was an excellent jumping off point. But in so doing, I was naive. Spell naive for me, Carla.
N-A-I-I-V-E, right? Is it
Two
I's?
V's?
I think it's just one eye.
One I. There we go.
Naive.
I can spell Scouser, but that's.
Explain to me what naive is, because you know, Carla. Tell me.
Just green, innocent.
I was naive.
Don't know any better.
I didn't know any better. I thought Latter-day Saints would be interested in understanding an alternative explanation of prophetic metaphors. Imagine my surprise when I encountered tremendous resistance. I can take 10 Latter-day Saints and present them with the basic concepts in the book, The Moon Shall Turn to Blood. And 9.9% of those people will turn and walk away. Why? Because it sounds strange. I've never heard that before. You don't know how many times I've heard people say that. I've never heard that before. What do the general authorities say about that? I don't know. I know there are men with opinions. Okay? But, well, anyway, I won't belabor that. They just think it's strange. Okay? So I was naive. Instead, this book is about attempting a new perspective. I wrote, this work is an attempt to introduce a new perspective on history and how it relates to prophecy, rather than try to predict the dates that come with prophetic events. One of the things that this requires, this cataloging, the end result was that we could then identify these events as they happened and know that we were approaching the end of the events and the cataclysms that are predicted in prophecy. Well, there's a little story I can tell you about. Let me take some of this off here. I'm going to leave naive up here because that's me. Okay. What happened is these, well, let me start with Joseph Smith. In his day, there was a man named William Miller. He started what came to be known as Millerism, which eventually became the Adventist movement. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, a number of other sects. And William Miller had done exactly what these LDS scholars that I just listed had tried to do. He'd gone into the Old Testament and he'd consulted the visions of the prophets, starting with John or in the New Testament and others, where they translate the words days as years, and they try to identify a point along the timeline where a certain number of days are calculated until the end of the world. And they identified the king of Persia, I've forgotten his name, when he ordained that the Jews should return from their captivity or diaspora in Babylon. The Persians conquered Babylon, and the king of Persia said, what are all these Jews doing here? Let's send them home and give them some money to build their temple so they can go back to Jerusalem where they came from. And so he identified that point in time as the thing as the important date, and the number of days that are talked about in the Old Testament were actually years, and he came up with the year 1830, I think it was 32. A couple of years, maybe 31, something like that, as the time for the second coming. Joseph Smith, of course, was contemporary with William Miller, and naturally he was asked, what about William Miller's predictions? And Joseph's response, and this is in his journal, The History of the Church, he said, well, Miller lacks the proper information. There isn't enough information in the Old Testament to make that kind of a conclusion. He says, well, you can't know. He said, the important thing is to look for the signs. You don't try to date it, you look for the signs. Well, we think we know what the signs are, but we don't. And I'll show you why. Joseph Smith, the very first event of the restoration was what? What actually kicked off the restoration?
Joseph Smith having questions.
Okay, and that resulted in what?
A prayer.
A prayer. And the prayer resulted in what?
Revelation.
Speak.
Revelation.
A revelation. We talk about the story of the first vision. What did Joseph Smith learn in the first vision? What was the question he was asking? My wife's going to answer this.
He learned that none of the churches at that time were true.
Yeah. It was the Lord, of course, that told him that. And what did the Lord say about those churches?
For him to join none of them.
Join none of them, because why?
They draw near to me with their mouths, but
With their lips.
Their hearts are
He used the word abomination. You remember? They are an abomination to me. Okay? So Joseph Smith knew when William Miller came along and made these predictions, Joseph Smith knew he was wrong. Certainly Revelation worked into that, but if he had had nothing more than the first vision, he would know the answer. William Miller was wrong. Why? Because William Miller was one of the people that Christ referenced when he told Joseph Smith, they are an abomination, or their teachings are an abomination to me. If they don't understand baptism, if they don't have priesthood power, if they have all of these problems, it also extends to their interpretation of prophecy. So it's easy for Joseph Smith to say, well, Miller was wrong. The interesting thing is that the day was in April, as I recall, early in April sometime, which all Latter-day Saints recognize as kind of an interesting time when the church was organized, and Joseph Smith's birth and that sort of thing. But Joseph Smith said the day, in fact, he wrote it in his journal. He said, the day that William Miller and his followers went out waiting for Christ to come, of course, Christ didn't come, and Joseph Smith wrote in his journal, it's too beautiful a day for false prophets. And it's a standalone little comment, unless you know what he's talking about, it's just floating out there. He was talking about William Miller. You see? So, my point in telling all of this is, if it sounds anything like what mainstream Christianity is teaching, it's probably wrong. Is that a fair statement to make based on what Christ told Joseph Smith in the Sacred Grove, do you think? I don't think you can come to any other conclusion. And yet, as Latter-day Saints, those of us who look into prophecy constantly fall into this trap. We look at the interpretations that mainstream Christianity has put on prophecy, and we say, that makes sense. But the reason I wrote this book, and have written stuff ever since, is because simply identifying information in the Old Testament, cataloging the prophecies, trying to create some order of events out of them, and then identify those events in modern times is misguided. You have to go back again to Joseph Smith and the Savior. Join none of the churches, they are an abomination to me. Joseph Smith is our touchstone. Joseph Smith is our guide. The other reason I wrote this book, I have to read the book to remember what my reasons were. Okay, the other reason that I've already touched on, and that is to create the metaphors, to create meaning for the metaphors. When it says the moon shall turn to blood, it means the moon will turn red. It will glow in the sky like a cinder in a fire. Yes?
So like on the new moon, you actually see the moon?
Yeah. Well, you mean they turn red? Yeah. Not this. What we see now is not anything like what the prophets are referring. The moon really did glow. It became incandescent. That's why astronomers have identified large portions of the moon were overflowed with lava at some point. They placed that event millions of years in the past. That makes it safe to talk about. We don't have to consider that it might happen again. If it happened a long time ago, then we really don't need to worry about it, and we can talk about it without inciting fear and dread and whatever else. So, understanding the metaphors is all important. I'm not going to go through the signs of the Exodus because they're in the book. But every one of the signs connected with the Exodus is a natural consequence of the intersection of two planets, as I described earlier. And all the effects that the prophets talk about are due to electromagnetic forces. You say, how did electromagnetic forces turn the water to blood? Well, the water turning to blood is material that precipitates out of the atmosphere, settles on the skin, and causes what they call boils and blains. Settles into the water, and it turns the water a ruddy, reddish color. Makes it putrid so that you can't drink. It'll kill you if you drink it. It's the very reason it causes boils and blains on the human skin and on animals, you see. So that's only one example. In my online classes, I go through a lesson called, what is the name of that lesson? Anyway, I go through a lesson about all of these natural consequences in a planetary catastrophe. And I explain all of these metaphors and what it means and what you can see in the future. In other words, the Exodus becomes a preview of the last days events. It's about the birth of the Israelite nation as a people. Of course, they identified themselves as Israelites before the Exodus, but they were literally created as a people. Their basic beliefs, their rituals, the temple, all of that was due to Moses. And this is one of the important things that we learn. Let's see if I can find that. Oh, I wanted to say one other thing about this. I know this is tough for a lot of people. There are going to be a lot of people online watching this, as well as you folks here, so I want to make this absolutely clear. If you don't believe me, there's only one way to find out if I'm right or wrong, and that's to test it for yourself. The Savior says something similar to this about tithing. Prove me herewith. So I'm going to exhibit a little bit of hubris here and say, prove me herewith. If this is wrong, prove me wrong. Study it for yourself. I have no qualms that if you will look into the information, you will see how much sense it makes, and it will become meaningful to you. The more you learn, the more compelling it becomes. At the outset, it looks very strange, but as you dig deeper into it, it begins to fit. It begins to come together. And eventually you will reach a point, you will reach a tipping point at which it will all come together. I talked to somebody online the other day who's been struggling with these issues for 3 or 4 years. Very enthusiastic to begin with, kind of got cool on it because he said, you talk about these things as though they're all natural and there's no spiritual component. Well, you know, you get the spiritual component every Sunday. It's the component that you've been raised with. I see my job, if you will, as to emphasize the natural side. It's the same thing that Talmage talks about when he says there's no such thing as a miracle. They're all natural events. All of these things that happened in the Exodus were natural consequences. God was not sitting on his throne in heaven and saying, now let's turn the water red, now let's have hail, now let's have frogs and locusts, now let's have... didn't work that way. It didn't. In fact, that for Latter-day Saints, that kind of a concept of God should fly in the face of rational thinking. And Talmage was making that point. Look, I'll go back to the first vision. There's something else that Joseph Smith learned in the first vision that we talk about all the time, or we used to talk about all the time. We don't talk about it, emphasize it near as much. Anybody figure out what that was? About the nature of God. What did Joseph Smith learn about the nature of God?
He's a physical God.
He is a body of flesh and blood. Flesh and bone, pardon. The point being, that's a naturalistic interpretation. It flies in the face of everything the Christian community believed in Joseph Smith's day. Highly controversial.
Well, the follow-up question, how did you know that? I mean, he saw it, but there's just the ringer, there's the voice. He was able to hear.
Yeah.
And a spirit can't audibly speak or hear. So
he saw them.
That's a very subtle thing, but it was picked up.
Yeah.
I mean, just on that thing alone.
And it's so important that as Latter-day Saints, we keep our perspective looking in that direction. The same is true of prophecy. All of the signs of the last days are based in natural events. God orders the universe through the natural forces. He does not preempt the law. He uses the law. Talmage makes this point. He knows how to use laws we're completely unaware of. But he's still using those same laws, those same forces. Okay? So that's something that I emphasize in the book that I wanted to touch on. In my second chapter, I wrote about the key to the past here. Joseph Smith, let me cite it here because, well, this is in Matthew, but let's see, let me go to page 70 here where it's, forgive me, there it is. Speaking in an April conference of the church in Nauvoo in 1843, the prophet Joseph Smith made a statement which, in the light of Velikovsky's thesis, of course, Velikovsky's thesis is that the Exodus was a natural event, a planetary event, is most interesting. And let me read this to you so that we can understand this. It is not the design of the Almighty to come upon the earth and crush it and grind it to powder. Now that's an indication of the level of the extinction events that are seen in these past planetary encounters. According to the Midrashic documents, which I cite here in the book, 49 out of 50 Israelites died during the Exodus. We get the impression that the Israelites walked out of Egypt untouched and unscathed, except for a few stragglers who wanted to fall back. But the Midrashic documents, which are rabbinical commentaries on the Old Testament, and yes, somewhat subject to interpretation, but that number is so great. 49 out of 50 Israelites died during the Exodus. That's a 2% survival rate. Joseph Smith was well aware of that. It is not the design of the Almighty to come upon the earth and crush it and grind it to powder. Then he goes on. There will be wars and rumors of wars, signs in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. The sun turned into darkness and the moon to blood. That's the name of the book. Earthquakes in diverse places, the seas heaving beyond their bounds. Each of those is interpreted by the LDS scholars who catalog these things. Okay? All these things are interpreted as discrete individual events. Oop, I put it down. Let me see if I can demonstrate this. The darkness happens over here. A little while later, the moon turns to blood. Maybe a year or two later, maybe a decade later, I don't know. And then, after that, the seas, well, heave beyond their bounds. We call them a tsunami. And we think of those as discrete events. But really, what the Exodus tells us, what the naturalistic view of the Exodus that I put in The Moon Shall Turn to Blood, is that these events are not discrete and separated in time. They happen one after the other, sometimes at the same time. At the same time that hot stones are falling out of the heavens, the moon is turning to blood and the water is turning red. At the same time. You see?
So just put in other words, you're saying these are symptoms of another cause for the actual thing that happened.
Correct. One cause. And that cause is the planetary encounter. Of the most disastrous kind. That's the message of the Exodus. And people say to me, well, wait a minute. Moses turned the water to blood. Moses parted the water. Moses called down the plagues. You read the Old Testament, you find out that's not the case. Deuteronomy is very explicit about it. The Lord told Moses when each of these things was going to happen and gave him the proscription, or the prescription, if you will, of how to avoid those things. And the lesson in that for us, one day a prophet is going to be raised up in the church, and he'll be raised up to lead us back to Jackson County in the wake of a planetary catastrophe. All early Latter-day Saints believed this because the early brethren taught it, because Joseph Smith taught it. Joseph said, look, let's get out of the Mississippi River Valley and move the saints to the mountains where they'll be safe and secure in these catastrophic events. Because when the seas heave beyond their bounds, the Gulf of Mexico is going to come up the Mississippi River Valley like a freight train. And it's going to sweep the land clean.
Didn't some of the early apostles have visions or dreams of?
Yeah, we don't know whether it's John Taylor's vision or Wilford Woodruff's vision, but you know what? It's right here, if I remember right, in this appendix. Maybe it's not, maybe it's in my second book. Anyway, in either case, I included it in here, or in the next book. Because it's important. As Latter-day Saints, we have drifted away from the understanding that Joseph gave us of these things. And we've allowed the evangelical view of prophecy and interpretation of ancient events to come into our view of things. And in so doing, we have made ourselves less knowledgeable where the scriptures are concerned, less knowledgeable where the gospel is concerned. Let me finish reading this, because this is interesting, and I've got a little story to tell about it, and then I'm going to end. The seas heaving beyond their bounds, then will appear one grand sign. Of course, we read about this grand sign in Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, let me put it over here. Grand sign. We read about it in Doctrine and Covenants. It's called a great sign there. But Joseph Smith says, then will appear one grand sign of the Son of Man in heaven. But what will the world do? In other words, what is everybody going to think it is? They will say it is a comet, a planet. But the Son of Man will come as the sign of the coming of Son of Man, which is how? Which will be as the light of the morning cometh out of the east. Why out of the east?
That's where the sun comes up.
It's where everything comes up in our current arrangement. Nothing comes up in the west or the south or the north. It all comes up in the east. Which means he's talking about a cosmic event, an astronomical event. Okay? So, here's my story. I read Velikovsky, and I wondered, could he be right? I had been looking for a long time for answers to questions that I saw in the scriptures. One of those questions, of course, was, what does prophecy mean? Beasts and stars and horses and kings. I mean, you name it. What in the world does all that imagery mean? I didn't even see it as imagery. I saw it as every other Latter-day Saint does, as some kind of literal explanation of things. Tried to make sense of it. One day, it was about I think, 75 in Reader's Digest. In the back of the book, they published a condensed version of Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision. In Worlds in Collision, and this is what this book is all about, explaining Velikovsky and how it relates to LDS doctrine and concepts and teaching. In Velikovsky, in his book, Worlds in Collision, he identified the agent of the Exodus as a planet-sized comet. Now, I've been looking for corroboration. Look, I measure everything by the restored gospel. If I can't find corroboration in the restored gospel, then I have cause to doubt a concept. I read Velikovsky. I was impressed that it was the most inclusive explanation of the Exodus that I had ever seen. And I'd read a lot of them. Volcanoes erupting and gases and all kinds of strange things. Admittedly, Velikovsky was strange. A planet? I'd been taught my whole life that all the planets moved exactly where they were supposed to be and had been for eons of time. Here's a man that said, no, just as a few hundred years before Christ, 1,000 years or so before Christ, Venus was moving on an erratic orbit in our solar system, and it nearly collided with the Earth during the time of the Exodus. Sounds pretty strange, right? So I'm looking for corroboration. If Velikovsky's right, it stands to reason somewhere, someone in the church, someone in authority, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Snow, somebody would have said something about this that would corroborate or destroy Velikovsky, one of the two. So I began search of the scriptures, got through the scriptures, got through the Book of Mormon, found no corroboration. Pearl of Great Price, Doctrine and Covenants, Old Testament seemed to corroborate it. Velikovsky cited the Old Testament extensively, but nothing in modern revelation. Someone said, have you read the history of the church? Then, just as now, I was very talkative about this stuff. It was important to me. Have you read the history of the church? No, why should I? Because that's Joseph Smith's journal. Maybe he said something in there. Boy, I'm down at the library and I've got those 7 volumes with actually 8 with the index, and I'm reading them. And I'm up through 4th, 3rd, 4th, 5th volume, nothing. And I get to the 5th volume, and I know I'm out of time, but I'll try to summarize here. 5th volume, page 337, History of the Church. And I read that statement by Joseph Smith. But what will the world do? They will say it is a planet, a comet. The sign of the Son of Man is a planet or comet. Prophet of God, the man who restored Christ's church in the last days, used exactly the same 2 words to describe the sign of the last days as Velikovsky had used to describe the agent of the Exodus. You could have knocked me over with a pin, with a feather. That's the correct use of the metaphor. You could have knocked me over with a feather. Thank you. I was stunned. I didn't even have to ask. The Spirit said, "That's right! You got it!" Tears started running down my cheek, and 1,000 things went through my mind that I'd never thought of before. Things that I would subsequently write in books and lectures and things like that. I ran upstairs to my then wife, my first wife, and I said, "Look, this is Velikowski, Joseph Smith." "Yeah," she says, "that's right. I'm cooking dinner. Leave me alone." I suddenly realized the past is prologue. Exodus is a preview of the last days. And by golly, when you start looking at it from that perspective, everything changes. Suddenly all those scriptures that I'd gone through that seemed to be making no reference to the things that I'd been looking for all made perfect sense. Did I understand it all? No. It took years and years of work. And let me just add this in closing. This is a demonstration of a work in progress. All my books are. I've had to kind of backpedal in a couple of places and say, well, I didn't fully understand this, and you'll see it when we get to the third lecture on early in June. This is a chronicle of my understanding, and it's changed, not radically, just a little, but each change has allowed me to understand better what the prophets were talking about, such that today I can read prophecy and understand what they're describing. And what we discover is that the one cause is related to a concept I call the one story. All the prophets saw the same vision. They just report it in different terms because they lived in different epochs and in different cultures. And they used the imagery that was well known and accepted in that culture. Just like Joseph Smith used the imagery of Christianity to teach the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have baptism, we have the sacrament, but we have a lot of other things that the other Christian churches don't acknowledge or don't even think is important, such as priesthood, such as organization. So my message with the first installment in these three is that Joseph Smith left us a message and a legacy, one that we have largely ignored and drifted away from where prophecy is concerned. And so my advice to everyone is, learn what that means. Learn what Joseph Smith, it will benefit you. You'll understand the scriptures. You'll understand your temple ordinances. You'll understand the things that Joseph Smith taught. Much of what he taught, some of the things that he taught, have been marginalized by LDS scholars over the years because they couldn't make sense of it. Why? Because it was based on this cosmic interpretation of things. So that's my counsel, and that's where I'm going to leave it tonight. Study the scriptures, but study them in light of cosmology. Consider the temporal, what I call the temporal side of the gospel. Understand the temporal as well as you do the spiritual, and your understanding of the gospel will grow by leaps and bounds, and your testimony will be tremendously strengthened. And that's my advice to you. Thanks.